The whisper of "too old" clung to Willow Cooper like dust on her worn boots as she stood at the edge of Promise Creek, staring at the weathered "for sale" sign she'd just hammered into the dry Texas soil. At 34, with wrinkles beginning to frame her eyes and silver threads weaving through her chestnut hair, the townsfolk of Redemption had already written her final chapter, a widow destined to fade away, her dreams of love and family buried alongside her husband. The year was 1876, and the relentless Texas sun beat down on Willow's shoulders as she wiped away the sweat beading on her forehead. 3 years had passed since influenza had taken Thomas, leaving her with a small ranch she could barely maintain and whispers that followed her through town like shadows. "Mrs. Cooper," called a voice from behind her. Willow turned to see Franklin Pearson, the banker, approaching with his leather ledger tucked under his arm. His expression carried that particular blend of pity and business that she'd grown to despise. "Have you reconsidered my offer?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles. $500 is more than fair for this challenging piece of land." Willow's jaw tightened. $500 for the ranch Thomas had built with his bare hands, the ranch they'd planned to fill with children's laughter. "The price is $800, Mr. Pearson," she replied, "as I've told you 3 times this month." Franklin clicked his tongue. "Mrs. Cooper, be reasonable. A woman in your situation should be practical. You're not getting any younger, and this land needs a man's touch." There it was again, that reminder that she was passing her prime, too old for new beginnings, too old for dreams. "Good day, Mr. Pearson," Willow said firmly, turning back toward her modest farmhouse. As the banker's footsteps receded, Willow allowed her shoulders to slump. The truth was, she didn't want to sell, but her resources were dwindling. The drought had withered her crops, and she'd had to sell most of the livestock. Without help, the Cooper ranch would slip through her fingers like the dry Texas soil. The following morning, Willow hitched her wagon and headed into Redemption. The small frontier town had grown considerably since the railroad had come through 5 years earlier, bringing with it new faces and opportunities. The main street was bustling with activity, merchants opening their shops, cowboys stumbling out of the saloon after a long night, and ladies in their morning finery gossiping outside the general store. Willow tied her horse outside Hargrove's general store and stepped inside, the little bell announcing her arrival. As she gathered her supplies, she couldn't help but overhear Mabel Wilson and Clara Jenkins whispering behind the fabric bolts. "Poor Willow Cooper," Mabel said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Did you hear she's selling that rundown ranch of hers?" "About time," Clara replied. "What's she going to do with it anyway? She's nearly 35 with no prospects. Too old to start over with a new husband, too stubborn to accept help." Willow gripped the sack of flour tightly, her knuckles turning white. She'd heard it all before: too old, too stubborn, too late. She placed her items on the counter, avoiding eye contact with Mr. Hargrove, who'd undoubtedly heard every word. "That'll be $3.45, Mrs. Cooper," he said, his voice softened with pity. Willow counted out the coins, each one representing hours of work, and pushed them across the counter. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove." As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, a commotion drew her attention to the far end of the street. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, their horses kicking up dust. At their lead was a man Willow had never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair peeking out from beneath a well-worn Stetson. Unlike the rowdy cowboys flanking him, he sat straight in his saddle, observing the town with quiet intensity. Sheriff Donovan approached the newcomers. "Welcome to Redemption. What brings you boys to our town?" The leader dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "Name's Quentin Blackwood. Looking for work. Heard the Circle S Ranch might be hiring." Willow couldn't help but study him. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes suggesting he was in his early 40s. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his dark beard flecked with gray. Despite his rugged appearance, there was something dignified in his bearing. Sheriff Donovan nodded. "Samuel Stevens lost his foreman last month. Might be worth asking." He gestured toward the saloon. "He usually takes his lunch at the Silver Dollar around noon." Quentin Blackwood touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, Sheriff." As the cowboys dispersed, Quentin's gaze swept the street, briefly connecting with Willow's. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, the color of the summer sky just before dusk. Then, with a slight nod in her direction, he turned and led his horse toward the livery. Willow quickly looked away, chiding herself for staring. A man like that wouldn't look twice at a worn-out widow with silver in her hair. She loaded her supplies into her wagon and untied her horse, eager to return to the solitude of her ranch. As she drove out of town, Willow couldn't shake the thought of those blue eyes. It had been so long since a man had truly looked at her, without pity clouding his gaze. But she knew better than to dwell on such foolishness. Quentin Blackwood was just passing through, and she had a ranch to save. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work. Willow repaired a section of fencing that had come loose in the last storm, tended to her small vegetable garden, and worried about the dwindling funds in her lockbox. No one had shown interest in buying the ranch at her asking price, and she was beginning to wonder if she'd have to accept Franklin Pearson's insulting offer after all. On Saturday, Willow was returning from checking on her remaining cattle when she spotted a rider approaching from the main road. She shaded her eyes against the setting sun, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the broad shoulders and easy posture of Quentin Blackwood. He reined in his horse a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Cooper," he called. Willow straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Yes, that's me." "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" He dismounted, removing his hat. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, clear and direct, with no trace of the condescension she'd grown accustomed to from men in redemption. "Samuel Stevens mentioned you might be looking for help with your ranch," he said. "Said you were selling, but hadn't found a buyer yet." Willow's defenses rose immediately. Mr. Stevens should mind his own affairs. The ranch isn't his concern. A slight smile touched Quentin's lips. "No offense meant, madam. I'm looking for work, and I thought you might need an extra pair of hands until you sell." Willow hesitated. She did need help desperately, but hiring a drifter seemed risky. "What do you know about ranching, Mr. Blackwood?" "Been working cattle since I was 12, he replied. "Managed the Double J Ranch in Wyoming for 8 years before coming south. I can break horses, mend fences, and birth calves with equal skill." His directness was refreshing, but Willow remained cautious. "I can't pay much. Barely making ends meet as it is." "I'm not asking for much," he said. "A fair wage for fair work. Maybe a place to bunk down." Willow considered his offer. Having help would allow her to get the ranch in better shape, perhaps fetch a higher price. And something about Quentin Blackwood's steady gaze made her want to trust him. "There's a cabin near the north pasture," she said finally. "It needs work, but it's shelter. I can pay $2 a day, plus meals." Quentin nodded. "That's fair. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you." "I'll be here at dawn," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Cooper." As he rode away, Willow wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But the prospect of having competent help lifted a weight from her shoulders she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The next morning, true to his word, Quentin arrived as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon. Willow was already up, feeding her chickens, when his horse trotted into the yard. "Morning, Mrs. Cooper," he called, tipping his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, setting down the feed bucket. "There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some before we get started." They sat on the porch, sipping coffee in the cool morning air. Willow outlined the most pressing tasks. The north fence line needed mending, the barn roof had a leak, and the few remaining cattle needed to be moved to better grazing. "I'll start with the fence," Quentin said, rising to his feet. "Might need to ride the perimeter first, get a sense of what we're working with." Willow asked, surprised. Quentin's expression remained neutral. "You hired me to help, not take over. I figured we'd work together, unless you had other plans." Willow couldn't remember the last time someone had treated her as a capable partner rather than a burden or an object of pity. "No, that sounds fine. Let me gather my tools." They rode out together, Willow leading the way to the damaged section of fence. As they worked side by side in the morning sun, she found herself stealing glances at Quentin. His movements were efficient and practiced, his focus absolute. When he rolled up his sleeves, she noticed scars crisscrossing his forearms, the marks of a man who'd lived a hard life. "How long have you had this ranch?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. My husband and I bought it 8 years ago, Willow replied, hammering a nail into place. It was nothing but overgrazed land and a ramshackle cabin then. Thomas had big dreams for this place. He built it up well, Quentin observed. Good, solid construction. Pride swelled in Willow's chest. He did. Worked from sunrise to sunset, sometimes by lantern light. She hesitated before adding, he died 3 years ago. Influenza took him in a week. Quentin paused his work, meeting her eyes with genuine sympathy, not pity. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Cooper. It's clear you loved him deeply. I did, she said simply, returning to her task to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The ranch was our dream. I've tried to keep it going, but it's too much for one person. You've done remarkably well, Quentin said, surprising her. Most would have sold immediately. Willow looked up at him, trying to determine if he was mocking her, but his expression was sincere. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. That means more than you know. They continued working throughout the day, falling into an easy rhythm. By sunset, they had repaired the entire north fence line, a task that would have taken Willow 3 days on her own. As they rode back to the house, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Willow felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Perhaps with Quentin's help, she could get the ranch in good enough shape to command a fair price. Or maybe. She quickly pushed away the foolish thought. There was no maybe. She had to sell. She was a woman alone in a world that had no place for her kind. Over the next 2 weeks, Quentin proved his worth many times over. The barn roof was repaired, the cattle moved to better pasture, and he'd even managed to find and patch a leak in the well pump that had been plaguing Willow for months. Each evening, they would share a simple meal, talking about the day's work and plans for tomorrow. Willow found herself looking forward to these quiet moments. Quentin was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his observations were thoughtful and often laced with a dry humor that made her laugh, something she'd almost forgotten how to do. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies emerge, Quentin asked, "Why are you really selling, Mrs. Cooper?" The directness of his question startled her. "I told you, it's too much for one person." Quentin's blue eyes studied her face. "With respect, you're handling it just fine, especially now that some of the bigger repairs are done." Willow looked away, unwilling to admit the truth that the whispers and pitying glances in town had worn her down, that she'd begun to believe what everyone said. A woman her age had no business trying to run a ranch alone, that she was too old to start over, too old to dream. "The bank is pressuring me," she said instead, which wasn't entirely untrue. "And the drought hasn't helped. I've had to sell most of the livestock just to keep afloat." Quentin nodded slowly. "I understand pressure. Ran into some myself up in Wyoming. That's why I came south looking for a fresh start." "What happened in Wyoming?" Willow asked, grateful for the change in subject. A shadow crossed Quentin's face. "Made some enemies. The ranch owner's daughter took a shine to me. Her father didn't approve of a foreman courting his only child, especially one with my background." "Your background?" Quentin was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't always on the right side of the law, Mrs. Cooper. Did some things in my youth I'm not proud of. Served 3 years in a territorial prison for robbery when I was 20. Willow's eyes widened. "You're an ex-convict?" "Reformed," he corrected gently. "Paid my debt and haven't strayed since. But some men don't believe people can change. Mr. Jennings was one of them. When he found out about my past, he gave me a choice: leave Wyoming or face charges of theft he'd fabricate." Willow should have been alarmed by this revelation, but instead, she found herself admiring his honesty. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I don't believe in hiding who I am," Quentin said. "If you want me to leave, I'll understand." "No," Willow said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "You've proven yourself trustworthy. Your past is your own." Relief flickered in his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper." "Willow," she said suddenly, "if we're sharing truths, you might as well use my name." A slow smile spread across his face. "Willow," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. "It suits you, strong but graceful." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. For the first time in years, Willow felt seen as a woman, not just as a widow or a failed rancher. The next day, they rode into town together to purchase supplies. Willow was acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed them down the main street. Quentin seemed oblivious, but she knew what they were saying, what they were assuming about her relationship with the rugged strangers staying at her ranch. At the general store, Mabel Wilson and her gossip circle fell silent as Willow and Quentin entered. Willow held her head high, selecting the items they needed while Quentin discussed fencing wire with Mr. Hargrove. "Mrs. Cooper," Mabel said sweetly, approaching with false concern in her eyes. "How lovely to see you in town. We've been so worried about you out there all alone." "I'm managing quite well, thank you," Willow replied coolly. Mabel's gaze darted to Quentin. "Yes, I see you found help. How fortunate for a woman in your position." The implication in her tone was unmistakable. Willow felt heat rising to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Before she could respond, Quentin appeared at her side. "Mrs. Wilson, isn't it?" he said, his voice polite, but with an edge of steel. "Mrs. Cooper has been kind enough to employ me while I'm in the area. She runs a tight ship and knows more about ranching than most men I've worked for." Mabel blinked, clearly not expecting to be addressed so directly. "Well, I'm sure she appreciates the assistance. At her age, starting over can be so difficult." "Starting over?" Quentin raised an eyebrow. "From what I've seen, Mrs. Cooper never stopped. She's kept that ranch running through drought and hardship with a determination that would put most to shame." The genuine admiration in his voice left Mabel speechless. She mumbled something about needing to check on her pies and hurried away. Willow stared at Quentin, a lump forming in her throat. No one had defended her like that since Thomas died. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly as they left the store. "I know," he replied simply, "but it needed saying." As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Sheriff Donovan approached. "Blackwood," he called. "Got a minute?" Quentin nodded to Willow and stepped aside with the sheriff. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she noticed the sheriff's serious expression and the way Quentin's shoulders tensed. When he returned to the wagon, his face was unreadable. "Everything all right?" she asked as they headed out of town. "Fine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Sheriff was just checking on my intentions in the area." Willow frowned. Why would he care about that? Quentin kept his eyes on the road. "Got a telegram from Wyoming. Seems Mr. Jennings has been telling tales." "Nothing to worry about," I explained the situation. But Willow could tell there was more to it than he was saying. The easy companionship they'd shared earlier was replaced by a tense silence as they made their way back to the ranch. That night, after a quiet dinner, Quentin excused himself early, saying he needed to check on a sick calf. Willow watched him go, a sense of unease settling over her. She'd grown accustomed to his presence in such a short time. The sound of his boots on the porch, his deep voice discussing the day's work, the way his rare smiles transformed his weather-worn face. The realization hit her with startling clarity. She was developing feelings for Quentin Blackwood. Foolish, impossible feelings that could only lead to heartbreak. She was a widow planning to sell her ranch and move on. He was a drifter with a complicated past. And she was, as everyone in town so helpfully reminded her, too old to be entertaining romantic notions. The next morning, Willow woke to the sound of raised voices in the yard. She hurried to the window to see Sheriff Donovan and two deputies confronting Quentin by the barn. "I'm not resisting," Quentin was saying, his hands raised slightly. "But I'm telling you, it's a misunderstanding." "Got a warrant from Wyoming territory," the sheriff replied, holding up a paper. "Says you stole a horse and $500 before leaving the Double J." Willow's heart sank. She quickly dressed and rushed outside, arriving just as the sheriff was placing handcuffs on Quentin. "Sheriff Donovan, what's happening?" she demanded. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Cooper, I'm afraid your hired hand is wanted for theft in Wyoming. Judge Jennings has sworn out a complaint." "Judge Jennings?" Willow repeated, looking at Quentin. "His brother," Quentin explained grimly. "Told you he had influence." "This is ridiculous," Willow protested. "Mr. Blackwood has been nothing but honorable since arriving in Redemption." Sheriff Donovan sighed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cooper, but I have to take him in. The judge will hear his case tomorrow." As they led Quentin to their horses, he looked back at Willow. "Don't worry about me," he called. "Take care of that sick calf in the north pasture." Willow frowned, confused by his words. There was no sick calf that she knew of. Then understanding dawned. He was trying to tell her something. After the sheriff and his men disappeared down the road with Quentin, Willow hurried to the north pasture. Near the cabin where Quentin had been staying, she found a hollow tree. Inside was a small leather pouch containing exactly $500 and a folded letter. With trembling hands, Willow opened the letter. To whom it may concern, I, Elizabeth Jennings, freely gave this money to Quentin Blackwood as payment for safe passage south. My father, Judge William Jennings, has threatened to commit me to an asylum if I do not marry Charles Whitmore, a man 30 years my senior. Quentin, having been our foreman for 8 years and a man of integrity despite my father's claims, agreed to help me escape. The horse he rides is mine, given to him as payment for his assistance. Elizabeth Jennings, April 12, 1876. Willow clutched the letter to her chest. Quentin wasn't a thief, he was helping a young woman escape a forced marriage. But would a judge in a small frontier town believe the word of a young woman against a powerful judge from Wyoming Territory? Without hesitation, Willow saddled her horse and rode into town. The jail was a small building next to the sheriff's office. She found Quentin in a cell, sitting on a narrow cot with his head in his hands. "Quentin," she called softly. He looked up, surprise, and then dismay crossing his face when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here, Willow." "I found the letter," she said, keeping her voice low. "And the money." Relief flooded his features. "Thank God. I was afraid they'd search my cabin and find it. That money belongs to Elizabeth. It's her inheritance from her mother. I was holding it until I could send it to her in Denver." "We need to show this to the judge," Willow insisted. Quentin shook his head. "It won't matter. Judge Parker is a fair man, but a letter won't outweigh the word of another judge. The Jennings family has connections all across the territories. So what do we do?" Willow asked, fear gripping her heart at the thought of Quentin being sent back to Wyoming to face false charges. Quentin's blue eyes met hers through the bars. "There's nothing to do. I knew the risk when I helped Elizabeth. I'd do it again." Willow's admiration for him grew even as her worry deepened. "I won't let them take you," she promised. That night, Willow couldn't sleep. She paced her small bedroom, the letter and money pouch sitting on her dresser. An idea began to form, a desperate, possibly foolish idea, but one that might just work. At first light, she dressed in her best dress, a navy blue calico she saved for church, and rode into town. Her first stop was the telegraph office, where she sent a message to Denver. Then she went to see Franklin Pearson at the bank. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, surprise evident in his voice as she entered his office. "Have you reconsidered my offer on your property?" "No, Mr. Pearson," Willow said firmly. "But I would like to withdraw $800 from my account." His eyebrows shot up. $800? That's nearly everything you have. "I'm aware of my balance, Mr. Pearson. The money, please." Reluctantly, the banker counted out the bills. Willow secured them in her reticule and headed to her next destination, the office of Judge Isaac Parker. The judge was a tall, imposing man with a reputation for being stern but fair. He listened carefully as Willow explained the situation, examining the letter from Elizabeth Jennings. "This is a serious accusation against a fellow judge," he said gravely. "What you're suggesting, that Judge Jennings would fabricate charges, is not something I can accept without evidence." "I understand," Willow replied. "But I also know Quentin Blackwood is an honorable man. He's worked tirelessly on my ranch for weeks. He's had ample opportunity to steal from me if that was his character, but instead, he's improved my property and treated me with nothing but respect." Judge Parker studied her face. "You care for this man?" It wasn't a question, but Willow answered anyway. "I do. More than I thought possible after losing my husband." The judge sighed. "I'll speak with him before making my decision. That's all I can promise." "Thank you, Your Honor," Willow said, rising to leave. Her last stop was the telegraph office again, where a message awaited her from Denver. She read it quickly, hope blossoming in her chest. At 2 o'clock, Quentin's hearing began in the small courthouse. Willow sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Quentin was brought in, his wrists still in handcuffs. He looked tired but composed. When he saw Willow, a mixture of emotions crossed his face: gratitude, concern, and something deeper that made her heart race. Judge Parker called the court to order. "We're here to determine whether Quentin Blackwood should be extradited to Wyoming Territory to face charges of theft. "Sheriff, please read the complaint." Sheriff Donovan stood and read from the telegram. Quentin Blackwood wanted for theft of one horse, valued at $75 and $500 in U.S. currency from the Double J Ranch, property of Judge William Jennings. "How do you plead, Mr. Blackwood?" Judge Parker asked. Quentin stood tall. "Not guilty, Your Honor. The horse and money were given to me by Elizabeth Jennings, the judge's daughter, as payment for helping her reach Denver safely." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Parker banged his gavel for silence. "That's a serious claim, Mr. Blackwood. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Before Quentin could answer, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A young woman in a traveling dress entered, followed by a well-dressed man in his 30s. "I believe I can provide that evidence, Your Honor," the woman said clearly. All heads turned. Quentin's eyes widened in shock. "Elizabeth." The young woman Elizabeth Jennings walked confidently to the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I am Elizabeth Jennings. I sent Mr. Blackwood the money and horse as payment for his assistance in helping me escape my father's home, where I was to be forced into marriage against my will." Judge Parker leaned forward. "Miss Jennings, these are serious allegations." "I am aware, Your Honor," she replied, "but I have brought proof. This is my attorney, Mr. Howard Grant of Denver. He has documentation of my father's attempts to have me declared mentally unfit after I refused to marry Charles Whitmore." The attorney stepped forward, presenting a folder of documents to the judge. As Judge Parker reviewed them, Elizabeth continued. "Quentin Blackwood worked for my father for 8 years. When I begged for his help, he risked everything to ensure my safety. The money was my inheritance from my mother, rightfully mine. The horse was a gift from my grandfather. Neither belonged to my father." Judge Parker looked up from the documents. "These appear to be in order. Mr. Blackwood, do you have anything to add?" Quentin shook his head. "Only that I never stole from Judge Jennings. I helped Elizabeth because it was the right thing to do, and I'd do it again." The judge considered for a moment. "Given the evidence presented, I find no cause to extradite Quentin Blackwood to Wyoming territory. The charges appear to be without merit. Sheriff, please remove those handcuffs." Relief washed over Willow as Sheriff Donovan unlocked Quentin's restraints. The courtroom erupted in conversation as people began to file out. Elizabeth approached Quentin, taking his hands in hers. "Thank you for everything, Quentin. I couldn't let my father destroy your life after you saved mine." "How did you know to come?" he asked. Elizabeth smiled, glancing at Willow. "I received a telegram from a Mrs. Cooper, explaining the situation. Mr. Grant and I took the first train south." Quentin turned to Willow, his expression a mixture of awe and gratitude. "You did this?" Willow nodded, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "I couldn't let them take you for something you didn't do." Before he could respond, Franklin Pearson pushed his way through the dispersing crowd. "Mrs. Cooper, I heard about your hired hand's arrest. I hope you'll reconsider my offer now. It's clear you need the security." Willow straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Pearson, not only am I not accepting your offer of $500, but I'm also withdrawing my ranch from sale entirely." The banker's mouth fell open. "But you can't possibly manage it alone." "She won't be alone," Quentin said, stepping to Willow's side. The certainty in his voice made her heart skip a beat. As they left the courthouse together, Willow felt lighter than she had in years. The afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the future seemed full of possibility rather than dread. "You were willing to spend everything to help me," Quentin said quietly as they walked toward the livery stable where their horses waited. "Why?" Willow stopped, gathering her courage to speak the truth that had been growing in her heart. "Because you made me believe in second chances, Quentin. You saw me not as a widow past her prime, but as a woman with strength and value." Quentin took her hands in his blue eyes earnest. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Willow Cooper. And far from being too old for anything, you're exactly the right age with enough wisdom to know your own mind and enough fire to fight for what matters." "And what matters to you?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Right now?" A smile spread across his face, transforming it. "You do. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay not as your hired hand, but as your partner. In ranching and perhaps in life." Willow's breath caught. "People will talk. They'll say I'm too old for such foolishness, that a woman my age should know better than to dream of love again. Let them talk, Quentin said, his voice low and intense. I've spent too many years caring what others think. The only opinion that matters to me now is yours. In answer, Willow rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with years of longing and newfound hope. When they finally parted, both breathless, the world around them seemed brighter somehow. I'll take that as a yes, Quentin said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Willow laughed a free, joyous sound that turned heads on the street. Yes, Quentin Blackwood. Yes to all of it. The whispers followed them as they rode out of town together, but for once, Willow didn't care. Let them talk about the widow and the drifter. Let them say she was too old, too foolish, too hopeful. She knew the truth. Now there was no such thing as too old for love, only hearts too afraid to try again. And hers, after lying dormant for so long, was finally, gloriously awake. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Willow. She and Quentin fell into a new rhythm, working side by side from dawn until dusk, transforming the Cooper ranch with each passing day. What had once seemed an overwhelming burden became a labor of love as they repaired, rebuilt, and expanded. A month after Quentin's acquittal, they sat together on the porch swing he'd built, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head nestled against his chest. I've been thinking, Quentin said, his deep voice rumbling against her ear. The south pasture would be perfect for breeding horses. I noticed your mare has good conformation, and with the right stallion, we could start a small but quality operation. Willow smiled at his use of we. It still sent a thrill through her every time he spoke of their future together. That's a good idea. The cattle market has been unpredictable, but there's always demand for well-trained horses. Exactly my thinking, he agreed, his fingers absently stroking her arm. And with the repairs to the irrigation system, we could expand the crops next spring. The railroad's always looking for reliable suppliers. Willow turned to look up at him, studying the strong lines of his profile in the fading light. You really see a future here, don't you? Quentin met her gaze, his eyes soft with emotion. I see our future, Willow, if that's what you want. It is, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. The beard he'd worn when he first arrived was gone now, revealing a strong jaw and the full extent of the scar that ran along it. She traced it gently with her fingertip. How did you get this? Quentin caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Bar fight in Cheyenne, about 10 years ago. A man accused me of cheating at cards. I wasn't, but he didn't wait for explanations before pulling a knife. And did you fight back? A rueful smile crossed his face. I did. Broke his nose and 2 of his fingers. Not my proudest moment, but it was before I learned there are better ways to resolve conflicts. And how would you resolve it now? Willow asked, curious. Walk away, he said simply. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and no game of cards is worth a man's life or dignity. He hesitated, then added, that's something prison taught me, the value of choosing your battles wisely. Willow's heart swelled with admiration for this man who had faced hardship and emerged not bitter, but wiser. You're a good man, Quentin Blackwood. I'm trying to be, he replied, his expression turning serious. Especially now that I have someone worth being good for. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Before she could respond, he slid from the swing and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Willow Cooper, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've lived enough to recognize what matters when I find it. You matter. This life we're building together matters. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. This was my mother's. I've carried it with me for 20 years, waiting for the right woman to give it to. Will you marry me? Tears filled Willow's eyes. For so long, she believed that chapter of her life was closed, that at 34, she was too old for new beginnings, too damaged by loss for new love. But Quentin had shown her otherwise. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been made for her. Quentin rose and gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the days to come. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption like wildfire. Some, like Sheriff Donovan and Elizabeth Jennings, who had returned to Denver but kept in touch through letters, sent their heartfelt congratulations. Others, like Mabel Wilson and her gossip circle, were less enthusiastic. Can you believe it? Willow overheard Mabel saying at the general store the following week, throwing herself at that drifter with a criminal past. At her age, it's embarrassing. Clara Jenkins nodded in agreement. Thomas Cooper must be rolling in his grave, God rest his soul. She was always a bit odd, but I never thought she'd be desperate enough to marry a jailbird. Willow's cheeks burned with anger and humiliation as she stood frozen in the next aisle, a sack of flour clutched to her chest. Before she could decide whether to confront them or slink away, another voice joined the conversation. "Ladies," said Agatha Reynolds, the elderly widow who ran the town's small library. "I couldn't help but overhear your concern for Mrs. Cooper." "Well, someone should be concerned," Mabel sniffed. "A woman her age, acting like a lovesick girl." "Her age?" Agatha repeated, amusement evident in her voice. "Willow Cooper is 34, not 94. And as for acting like a lovesick girl, well, I'm 72 and would count myself blessed to find love again at any age." "But he's an ex-convict," Clara protested. "Who served his time and by all accounts has lived an honest life since," Agatha countered. "Judge Parker himself dismissed the charges against him. And have either of you bothered to notice how the Cooper Ranch has flourished since his arrival? Or how Willow smiles again for the first time in 3 years?" Mabel and Clara fell into uncomfortable silence. "I remember when my Harold died," Agatha continued, her voice softening. "Everyone had opinions about how I should grieve, how long I should wear black, when I should sell our house. But grief and love don't follow rules or timetables. They're as individual as the people who experience them." The steel returned to her tone. "So perhaps instead of clucking like hens over Willow finding happiness again, you might try being happy for her." Willow set down her flour and stepped around the corner. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," she said quietly. Agatha's eyes twinkled as she took in Willow's presence. "No need to thank me for speaking the truth, my dear. And may I offer my congratulations? Mr. Blackwood seems a fine man." "He is," Willow confirmed, lifting her chin as she met Mabel and Clara's embarrassed gazes. "The finest I've known since Thomas. And you're right, I am happy. Happier than I believed possible." With that, she gathered her supplies, paid Mr. Hargrove, and left the store with her head held high. Agatha's words had soothed something within her, the lingering doubt that perhaps the gossipers were right, that she was too old or foolish to start again. As she loaded her purchases into her wagon, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Agatha approaching with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A wedding gift," the older woman explained, handing it to Willow. "Something old, as they say." Willow unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound book, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. "It was always my favorite," Agatha said. "A reminder that real love doesn't bow to convention or others' expectations. It simply is wild and true." Tears pricked Willow's eyes as she hugged the older woman. "Thank you. Will you come to the wedding? It's going to be small, just at the ranch next month." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Agatha promised. "Now go home to that man of yours. And don't waste another moment worrying what this town thinks. Most of them wouldn't recognize true happiness if it danced naked in the street." Laughing, Willow climbed into her wagon and headed home to Quentin, to their ranch, to the future they were building together. The wedding took place on a perfect October day, with the cottonwood trees along Promise Creek turned to gold and the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Willow wore a simple dress of ivory silk new, not the black bombazine she'd worn to marry Thomas. This was a different love, a different life, and it deserved its own beginnings. Pastor Mitchell performed the ceremony in the meadow behind the ranch house, where Quentin had constructed an arch entwined with late-blooming wildflowers. The guest list was small. Elizabeth Jennings had traveled from Denver with her attorney, now clearly more than her legal counsel, Sheriff Donovan and his wife, Agatha Reynolds, and a few of the ranch hands Quentin had hired as their operation expanded. Notably absent were the gossips from town, though Willow had extended invitations in a gesture of goodwill. Their absence was a relief rather than a disappointment. "Do you, Quentin James Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Mitchell asked, his voice carrying across the meadow. Quentin's blue eyes never left Willow's face as he answered, I do. And do you, Willow and Cooper, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Willow replied, her voice clear and certain. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Quentin's kiss was gentle yet passionate, a perfect reflection of the man himself. As they turned to face their small gathering of well-wishers, Willow felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not fading away as the town had expected, but blooming anew, her life expanding in ways she'd never imagined possible. The celebration continued into the evening, with lanterns strung from the oak trees and a feast spread across tables in the yard. Quentin had insisted on hiring a fiddler from the next town over, and as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, he pulled Willow to her feet for their first dance as husband and wife. Happy? He asked, holding her close as they swayed to the music. Completely, she answered, resting her head against his chest. Though I keep expecting to wake up and find this has all been a dream. His chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. If it is, then I'm dreaming too, and I've no desire to wake up. Later, after their guests had departed and they were alone in the ranch house, their home now truly shared, Quentin carried Willow across the threshold of their bedroom. Their coming together was both tender and passionate, a physical expression of the love that had grown between them against all odds. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Quentin traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed quietly. A home, a wife, a future worth fighting for. When I rode into redemption, I was just looking for work somewhere to lay low until I figured out my next move. And instead, you found me, Willow said, smiling up at him. Best detour I ever took, he agreed, kissing her forehead. When I saw that for sale sign, something told me to stop. I'm glad I listened. Willow's fingers found the scar along his jaw, tracing it gently. I'm glad too, even though it means giving up my status as the town's favorite object of pity. Quentin laughed. How will you bear the disappointment? I'll manage somehow, she said dryly, then grew serious. You know, for 3 years, all I heard was that I was too old to start over, too set in my ways for change. I started to believe it. And now, she pressed a kiss to his chest, just above his heart. Now I know better. It wasn't age holding me back, it was fear. Fear of failing, fear of being hurt again. And what changed, he asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. You did, Willow said simply. You looked at me and saw possibility, not limitation. You said I was just right, not too old, not too young, not too anything. Just Willow. Quentin gathered her closer. The most beautiful name in the English language, as far as I'm concerned. They fell asleep in each other's arms, the moonlight spilling through the window and bathing them in its silver glow, a blessing on this new beginning. This defiance of expectations, this love that had bloomed when both had thought their hearts too scarred to flower again. Spring came to Promise Creek with an explosion of wildflowers and new life. The Cooper Blackwood Ranch, as it was now known, had weathered its first winter under joint management with remarkable success. Their small herd of breeding horses was growing, with 3 new foals born in April alone. The cattle were thriving on the improved pasture land, and the crops Quentin had suggested were already showing promise. But the most significant new arrival was still on its way. Willow stood by the corral, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she watched Quentin working with their newest acquisition, a spirited black stallion with a white blaze down his face. Easy, thunder, Quentin murmured, his voice low and soothing as he led the horse in a circle. That's it, boy. No one's going to hurt you here. The stallion, initially skittish and prone to bolting, was gradually responding to Quentin's patient handling. Willow marveled at her husband's gentle way with the animals, the same patience and understanding he showed with everyone, including her. As if sensing her thoughts, Quentin looked up and caught her watching. His face broke into a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. Should you be on your feet? He called, securing the stallion's lead to a post and crossing to the fence. Willow rolled her eyes, but her smile belied her exasperation. Dr. Simmons said walking is good for me. It's not as if I'm breaking horses or mending fences. Quentin vaulted over the corral fence and placed his hands on her shoulders, his expression a mixture of concern and adoration. Can't blame a man for worrying about his wife and child. 6 more weeks, Willow said, guiding his hand to her belly where their baby was kicking vigorously. Then you can worry about diapers and midnight feedings instead. The wonder on Quentin's face as he felt their child move never failed to touch her. When she'd told him she was expecting, for months after their wedding, he'd been silent for so long she'd feared he was upset. Then she'd seen the tears in his eyes and understood he'd never expected this blessing either, a child at his age. "Do you still think it's a boy?" he asked, his hand splayed protectively over her rounded abdomen. "I do," Willow confirmed. "Though I'll love her just as much if I'm wrong." They'd already chosen names, Thomas James for a boy, after both their fathers, or Elizabeth and for a girl, honoring the young woman who had helped clear Quentin's name and Willow's mother. A rider approaching down the long drive interrupted their moment. Quentin straightened, his posture shifting subtly to alertness as he recognized Sheriff Donovan. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he called as the lawman drew closer. "What brings you out our way?" Sheriff Donovan dismounted, removing his hat in deference to Willow. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're looking well." "Thank you, Sheriff," Willow replied, noticing his careful avoidance of Quentin's question. "Would you like some coffee? I just put a pot on." "That would be welcome, thank you," the sheriff said, following them to the house. Once they were settled at the kitchen table with steaming cups before them, Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. "I received a telegram this morning that might interest you both. Judge William Jennings passed away last week in Cheyenne. Heart failure, according to the report." Quentin's face remained impassive, but Willow felt him tense beside her. "I see," he said neutrally. "And you rode all the way out here to tell us this, because the charges against you have been officially dropped," the sheriff explained. His successor reviewed the case and, given Miss Jennings' testimony and affidavit, determined there was no crime committed. Relief washed over Willow. Though Quentin had been cleared in their local court, the specter of Wyoming justice had lingered in the background of their happiness. "That is good news," she said when Quentin remained silent. "Thank you for bringing it personally." The sheriff nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "There's more. Miss Jennings, though I understand she's Mrs. Grant now, has inherited her father's estate. She's selling the Double J Ranch and asked me to deliver this." He pulled an envelope from his vest pocket and handed it to Quentin. Quentin opened it carefully. Inside was a bank draft for $200 and a brief note. He read it aloud. "For years of loyal service never properly compensated. The past is settled. May your future be blessed. Elizabeth." "Generous of her," Sheriff Donovan commented. "She always was," Quentin said quietly, folding the note and tucking it back into the envelope. "Please convey our thanks when you respond, and our congratulations on her marriage." After the sheriff departed, Willow found Quentin on the porch, staring out at the land that had become their shared dream. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He turned to her, his expression clearing. "Better than all right. It feels like the last shadow has lifted. Our child will be born into sunlight, not beneath the cloud of my past." Willow leaned against him, his arm automatically coming around her shoulders. "Our past made us who we are, Quentin. Without your hardships, you might never have come to redemption. Without mine, I might never have put up that for sale sign that caught your attention." "True enough," he agreed, his fingers gently stroking her arm. "Still, it's good to know it's truly behind us now." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. The evening air was sweet with the scent of grass and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill began its twilight song. "I've been thinking," Quentin said after a while. "With the money from Elizabeth and the profits from the spring cattle sale, we could add on to the house. A proper nursery for the baby, maybe another bedroom for when he gets older. Or for siblings." Willow looked up at him, her heart full. "Siblings? You're planning quite far ahead, Mr. Blackwood." His smile was both tender and mischievous. "I believe in looking to the future, Mrs. Blackwood. After all, we're just getting started." On a warm June morning, as the sun crested the eastern hills, Thomas James Blackwood made his entrance into the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. Willow, exhausted but radiant, cradled their son as Quentin sat beside them on the bed, one finger captured in the newborn's surprisingly strong grip. "He has your eyes," Quentin said in wonder, studying the clear blue gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. And your chin, Willow observed. Stubborn already. Quentin laughed softly. With us as parents, he didn't stand a chance at being anything else. As if in agreement, little Thomas gurgled and waved his free fist. Outside, the ranch was coming to life, horses nickering in the corral, cattle lowing in the distance, ranch hands starting their day's work. Inside, in the quiet of their bedroom, a family that defied expectations celebrated its newest member. Later, as Willow drifted off to sleep with Thomas nestled securely in the cradle beside her, Quentin stood at the window watching the life they'd built together. 2 years ago, he'd been a drifter with a shadowed past and no real future. She'd been a widow labeled too old for second chances. How wrong they'd all been, he thought with a smile, gazing at his sleeping wife and son. They weren't too old, they were just right for each other. And their story was only beginning. Outside, the sign that once read "For Sale" had long since been repurposed as part of the chicken coop. In its place at the entrance to the ranch stood a new sign, hand-carved by Quentin during the long winter evenings as they awaited their child's arrival. Cooper Blackwood Ranch. EST 1876. Where second chances take root. It was their declaration to the world and a daily reminder to themselves that it's never too late to begin again, to find love, to create the life you were meant to live. All it takes is the courage to try again and someone who believes you're just right, exactly as you are. 5 years passed, bringing changes both great and small to the Cooper Blackwood Ranch. The small horse breeding operation that had begun with a handful of mares and one temperamental stallion had grown into a respected enterprise, with their horses sought after throughout the territory for their intelligence and stamina. The cattle herd had doubled, and the crops Quentin had suggested now supplied not only their own needs, but those of several merchants in Redemption and beyond. But the most precious growth was within their family. Thomas, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quiet determination, had been joined 2 years earlier by Elizabeth and Ellie, as they called her, a spirited toddler whose dark curls and infectious laugh were the delight of everyone who knew her. The house had expanded as well. With the addition Quentin had promised the day they received news of Judge Jennings' death. What had once been a modest farmhouse was now a comfortable family home, with enough room for their growing family and the occasional guest. One such guest, Agatha Reynolds, sat on the expanded porch on a pleasant September afternoon, watching as Quentin taught Thomas how to groom a gentle bay mare, while Willow worked in the garden with Ellie helping by carrying water in a small bucket that spilled more than it delivered. "You've built something remarkable here," Agatha observed as Willow joined her on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not just the ranch, but this family." Willow smiled, her gaze following her husband and son as they led the mare back to the corral. "We've been blessed," she agreed. "More than I ever thought possible. And to think you almost sold this place," Agatha mused. "What a loss that would have been." "Everything happens for a reason," Willow said, settling into the chair beside her friend. "If I hadn't put up that for sale sign, Quentin might never have stopped. We might never have met." Agatha nodded, her wise eyes twinkling. "Life has a way of bringing us what we need, even when we think we know what we want." She reached over to pat Willow's hand. "I've lived long enough to see it time and again. Those whispers that you were too old were never anything but fear wearing a disguise." "Fear, of course," Agatha said matter-of-factly. "People fear what challenges their beliefs. If a widow of 34 could find love again, build a new life, then perhaps age isn't the barrier they believe it to be. Perhaps it's never too late to try again, to risk one's heart. And that's a frightening thought for those who've settled for safety over possibility." Willow considered this, watching as Ellie abandoned her watering duties to run to her father, arms outstretched. Quentin swung her up onto his shoulders with practiced ease, her giggles carrying across the yard. "I was afraid too," Willow admitted. "Afraid of failing, of being hurt again. If Quentin hadn't been so persistent. But he was," Agatha finished for her, "because he saw what those fools in town couldn't, that you were exactly right for him. Not too young, not too old, but perfectly, wonderfully Willow." The wisdom of her words settled over Willow like a warm blanket. Looking at her family, her handsome husband, now giving both children rides on the patient mare, their faces alight with joy, she felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, every step of it necessary, even the painful ones. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed and Agatha had retired to the guest room, Willow and Quentin sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head nestled against his chest, a position as familiar to them now as breathing. "I got a letter from Elizabeth today," Quentin said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She and Howard are expecting their second child in February." "That's wonderful news," Willow replied. "We should send them something for the baby. Perhaps one of those blankets Mrs. Donovan is selling at the mercantile." Quentin nodded, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "She also mentioned that Charles Whitmore, the man her father wanted her to marry, passed away last month. Apparently, he'd been in poor health for years." Willow shivered slightly, thinking of how differently Elizabeth's life might have unfolded. She would have been a widow by now, possibly with children to raise alone. Instead, she's happily married to a man who adores her, with a growing family and the freedom to choose her own path. Quentin's voice held a note of satisfaction. "Sometimes doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, leads to more good than we could imagine. Like you helping her escape," Willow said, looking up at him. "Even knowing it might cost you everything." "I couldn't live with myself if I'd done otherwise," he said simply. "Though I never expected it would lead me to you." His blue eyes, still as clear and direct as the day they'd met, held hers. "The best reward I never saw coming." Willow's heart swelled with love for this man who had defied her expectations in every way. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped here that day? If you'd ridden on to the next town?" Quentin considered this, his gaze drifting to the stars. "I believe I would have felt something missing, though I might not have known what. Some part of me would have recognized the absence of you in my life." He looked back at her, his expression serious. "And you? Do you ever regret not selling the ranch? You could have had an easier life, perhaps in a city with more comforts." "Never," Willow said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This land, this life we've built together, it's everything I never knew I wanted." She pressed a kiss to his chest, just above his heart. "And you, Quentin Blackwood, are everything I never dared to hope for." He captured her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm, a gesture that still sent warmth cascading through her after all these years. "As are you, my love. As are you." They fell into comfortable silence again, the gentle creaking of the swing a counterpoint to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses, the whispering of the wind through the cottonwoods along Promise Creek. This was their symphony, the music of the life they'd created together against all odds and expectations. A life that had begun with whispers of "too old" and a cowboy's simple declaration, "You're just right for me." And as the stars continued their eternal dance overhead, Willow knew with bone-deep certainty that they were both exactly where they were meant to be, not too early, not too late, but right on time for the love that had been waiting for them all along. 10 years after Quentin Blackwood rode into redemption and changed Willow Cooper's life forever, the Cooper Blackwood Ranch stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when two determined souls joined forces. What had once been a struggling widow's homestead was now one of the most prosperous properties in the county, with a reputation for quality horses, cattle, and crops that extended well beyond the territorial boundaries. But more important than their material success was the family they had built. Thomas, now 15, had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's height and his mother's gentle spirit. 12-year-old Ellie was the image of Willow at that age, with a natural affinity for horses that had made her Quentin's shadow in the stables since she could walk. And 7-year-old Michael, their unexpected blessing born when Willow was 41, much to the renewed scandal of redemption's gossips, had his father's charm and his mother's stubborn determination. The whispers of "too old" had long since faded, replaced by grudging admiration for what the Cooper Blackwoods had accomplished. Even Mabel Wilson, now widowed herself and perhaps more understanding of life's unexpected turns, had come to acknowledge that Willow and Quentin's union had been blessed with unusual happiness. On a crisp October morning, the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Willow stood at the kitchen window, watching as Quentin and Thomas worked with a spirited young colt in the corral. At 52, Quentin's dark hair was now liberally streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he moved with the same fluid grace that had first caught her attention all those years ago. "Mama," called Michael, tugging at her skirt. "Can I go help Papa and Thomas with Thunderbolt?" Willow smiled down at her youngest, his blue eyes so like his father's bright with eagerness. "After you finish your breakfast, young man. Those flapjacks won't eat themselves." As Michael raced back to the table, Ellie looked up from the book she was reading. "Mother," Mrs. Reynolds sent over the new novel she promised. "Shall I leave it on your bedside table?" "Thank you, darling," Willow replied, touched by her daughter's thoughtfulness. Agatha Reynolds, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, kept Willow supplied with the latest literature from back east. It was their shared pleasure books and the worlds they contained. After the children had scattered to their morning tasks, Thomas and Michael to the corral, Ellie to her lessons with Mrs. Hargrove in town, Willow stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, savoring the rare moment of solitude. At 44, she no longer worried about the silver threading through her chestnut hair or the laugh lines that framed her eyes. They were badges of a life well lived, marks of joy rather than sorrow. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Quentin approach until his arms slipped around her waist from behind. "A penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. Willow leaned back against his solid warmth. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in 10 years. How much we've built together." He agreed, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Though the best part hasn't changed at all." "What's that?" "How my heart still skips a beat when I see you first thing in the morning," he said, turning her in his arms to face him. "How I still can't believe my luck that you said yes to a battered old cowboy with more past than future." Willow reached up to trace the scar along his jaw, a gesture that had become a symbol of affection between them. "That cowboy saw me when no one else did. He told me I was just right when everyone else said I was too old." Quentin's blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Smartest thing I ever said." From the corral, Thomas called out a question about the colt's training, momentarily drawing Quentin's attention. As he answered, Willow studied his profile, still handsome after all these years, still the face she most loved to see first thing in the morning and last thing at night. "I have something for you," he said, returning his focus to her. "For our anniversary, though I planned to give it to you tonight after dinner." Curiosity piqued, Willow raised an eyebrow. "Now you have to tell me." Quentin chuckled. "Your patience hasn't improved with age, I see." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I had it made in Denver when I took the horses last month." Willow opened the pouch and gasped softly as a delicate gold locket slid into her palm. It was exquisitely crafted, with a filigree pattern that reminded her of the wildflowers that bloomed along Promise Creek in spring. "Open it," Quentin urged gently. Inside were two tiny portraits on one side. Quentin as he had looked when they first met, his expression serious but with that hint of kindness in his eyes that had drawn her to him. On the other, Willow from the same time, her face still carrying the shadows of grief but with the first glimmers of hope returning. "To remember where we started," Quentin explained, his voice thick with emotion. "And how far we've come." Tears blurred Willow's vision as she closed the locket and pressed it to her heart. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Quentin fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers lingering on the sensitive skin at her nape. "I have one more surprise, but it will have to wait until tonight. The children are involved." Intrigued, Willow tried to wheedle more information from him, but Quentin remained steadfast. "Patience, Mrs. Blackwood," he teased, stealing a kiss before returning to his work with the horses. The day passed in a pleasant blur of routine tasks and anniversary well-wishes from neighbors and friends who stopped by. Elizabeth and Howard Grant, visiting from Denver with their 3 children, arrived in the afternoon with gifts and news of mutual acquaintances. Sheriff Donovan, now retired but still a respected figure in Redemption, rode out with his wife to deliver a hand-carved chest set, a hobby he'd taken up in his retirement. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Quentin insisted that Willow take some time to dress for dinner. "Wear something nice," he suggested with a mysterious smile. "The blue dress, perhaps." Curious but willing to play along, Willow bathed and changed into the sapphire blue dress she'd ordered from a catalog last Christmas, one of her few concessions to vanity. As she pinned up her hair, leaving a few tendrils to frame her face the way Quentin liked, she heard the sounds of activity downstairs, voices, laughter, the clatter of dishes. When she finally descended the stairs, she stopped in surprise. The dining room had been transformed. The table was set with their best china and crystal, wedding gifts rarely used, and candles filled the room with golden light. But it wasn't just the setting that took her breath away, it was the gathering. Along with their children and the Grants, Agatha Reynolds sat in a place of honor, her wrinkled face beaming. Sheriff and Mrs. Donovan chatted with Franklin Pearson, now a friend, despite their rocky beginning, and his wife. Several of their longtime ranch hands stood somewhat awkwardly in their Sunday best, clearly part of whatever Quentin had planned. And at the center of it all stood her husband, looking more handsome than ever in a new suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his blue eyes alight with love and pride as they fell on her. "What is all this?" Willow asked, overwhelmed by the unexpected gathering. Quentin crossed to her, taking her hands in his. 10 years ago, we stood before a small group of friends and promised to love each other for the rest of our lives. I thought it fitting to celebrate that promise with the family and friends who have shared our journey. Thomas stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. Pa asked us to help, he explained, his voice deepening into the man he was becoming. Ellie picked the stones, and Michael helped design the setting. Quentin took the box and opened it, revealing a gold band set with small sapphires and diamonds. "My mother's ring has served you well," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "But I wanted to give you something that represents not just my past, but our future, something created with the help of the children we've raised together." Fresh tears welled in Willow's eyes as Quentin slipped the new ring onto her finger, where it nestled perfectly alongside her original wedding band. 10 years ago, he said, loud enough for all to hear. "People said you were too old to try again. I said you were just right for me. Time has proven me correct in ways I couldn't have imagined." His voice dropped to a near whisper, meant for her alone. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, Willow. For giving me a home, a family, a purpose. For making these the best years of my life." Unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, Willow rose on tiptoes and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. The room erupted in applause and a few good-natured whistles from the ranch hands. As they broke apart, Ellie appeared at her side, holding a package wrapped in brown paper. "We have something for Papa, too," she said, her eyes so like Willow's dancing with excitement. Willow took the package, suddenly nervous. It had been Thomas's idea, supported enthusiastically by his siblings, a gift that had taken months of secret work to prepare. "The children helped with this as well," she explained as she handed it to Quentin, though in a different way. Quentin unwrapped the package carefully, his expression shifting to one of wonder as he revealed a leather-bound book. The cover was embossed with simple, elegant lettering. "The Cooper Blackwood Legacy, Our Story." "Open it," Willow encouraged softly. Inside, Quentin found page after page of their history together, photographs, pressed flowers from significant occasions, drawings by the children, copies of important documents like their marriage certificate and the children's birth records. But most precious were the handwritten accounts, Willow's elegant script narrating their love story from her perspective, interspersed with contributions from Thomas, Ellie, and even young Michael, who had dictated his thoughts for Ellie to transcribe. "This is," Quentin began, his voice faltering as he turned the pages reverently. "This is our life. The story that began when a stubborn widow put up a for sale sign and a reformed cowboy decided to stop and offer his help," Willow said, her heart full to bursting. "The story that wasn't supposed to happen, according to some. The best story ever," Michael declared with a child's certainty, making everyone laugh. Quentin closed the book carefully and drew Willow into his arms. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For this, for our children, for everything." The celebration continued with a feast prepared by Mrs. Donovan and some of the neighboring women. Stories were shared, memories recounted, and toasts offered to the couple who had defied expectations and built a life richer than either had dreamed possible. Later, after the guests had departed and the children had gone to bed, Willow and Quentin stood on the porch in the moonlight, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder as they gazed at the stars. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Blackwood," Quentin murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Here's to the next 10 years. His smile, the one that still made her heart race after all this time, spread slowly across his face. And the 10 after that, as their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of new love and all the depth of a decade shared. Willow sent a silent prayer of gratitude to the stars above. For second chances and new beginnings. For a man who had seen beyond society's limitations to the woman she truly was. For the wisdom to recognize that sometimes what others call too old is actually just right, not just for love, but for the life you were always meant to live.